Hi everyone, this is the last lecture in week 6, so week 6, lecture 6. This should be a pretty short one and hopefully kind of fun. I just want to give you some learning tips for how to enhance your memory. Hopefully these will help you as you prepare for exams and really just in enhancing your memory throughout your life. So here we go. As I mentioned earlier, it's better to spread your study time out rather than cramming. So you definitely want to always do little bits at a time instead of sitting down the night before and packing it all in. I know we tend to think, oh, I'll give myself a good 10 hours the night before. I can really learn it all. Unfortunately, that just doesn't work very well. It's also really effective to frequently test yourself on the material you read. So this means periodically putting your book down, covering it up, and asking yourself questions as you go along. Doing this helps to retain the material. Otherwise, what happens is you will tend to skim or gloss over something in the text and go, oh, yeah, I know that. I don't need to read it. But when you close the book and take a step away, it forces you to really think about it. We learned early on that elaborative rehearsal is the way to go. So you want to connect new knowledge with existing knowledge instead of relying on rote memorization. So instead of just trying to drill things into your head, connect them as best you can with events that you experience in your everyday life. We talked about the levels of processing. So you want to process ideas in deep and meaningful ways. The more meaning we can attribute, the better chance we have at retaining the information. And mnemonic devices actually encompass several of these earlier concepts that we've talked about. So the more cues you can connect from your knowledge to new material, the better. Mnemonics are a learning aid. They're a strategy or device that help to enhance recall. They help us to organize meaningful information during encoding and help with later retrieval. So I'm sure you've all heard of the mnemonic device for remembering the order of operations in mathematics, PEMDAS, or please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. And every good boy does fine is another commonly used mnemonic for remembering the musical notes in a treble clef. While mnemonics can be used with almost anything, they depend on existing knowledge store. To be used effectively, they require patience, training, and creativity. Now, there's a few different mnemonic approaches. One is the peg word method, which uses rhyming to recall a list of words. So for an oversimplistic example, take the kid trying to learn numbers by saying 1 is a bun, 2 is a shoe, 3 is a tree. We'll table that for a second, we'll come back to it. The method of loci uses imagery of places. So maybe visualizing your route to work and then placing the information you need to remember along that route to help you remember as you visualize. So, okay, as I'm driving down this street, I'm thinking about the first couple numbers. As I'm driving down this street, I'm thinking about the second couple numbers. The keyword method uses a word that reminds you of a word you're trying to remember. People might use this with names. So Andrew likes avocados, avocado Andrew, which can then help you to remember Andrew's name. And finally, putting a list of material to be learned to a familiar melody can be really helpful in remembering. Many of you mentioned in your introductory posts that music is really important to you. So this might be one that you could think of. Unfortunately, I don't have any great examples for you, but I would love if any of you come up with a musical mnemonic to help you remember any of the course content. I would certainly love to hear it. So let me show you this short video that talks a little bit more about mnemonics.
Learn words in new languages by connecting how you know those phrases that just seem to be ingrained in your memory from middle school? Like, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, Roy G. Biv, or 30 days, half September, April, June, and November? Sound familiar? These are different kinds of mnemonics. Shortcuts that we use to help us remember stuff, like the order of operations or the color of a rainbow. Turns out there are a lot of strategies to remember information when you need it most. Take the mnemonic, my very educated mother just served us nachos. The first letter of each word stands for a planet in our solar system, from Mercury to Neptune. Now, when you first think about it, mnemonics like this don't seem to be a very helpful memory trick, because you have to remember twice as much, like a weird sentence plus all of the names of the planets. But that's actually why they work. A simple way to think about memory is that we store information, kind of like sticking a file in a filing cabinet or those shelves of orbs in Inside Out. until we recall or remember it later. And researchers studying how people learn suggest that recalling information can be easier when it's connected to other information we already know. So you can imagine this model of memory like a web of files, where the ones with more connections are less likely to be lost and easier to recall. One influential theory, which was published in the British Journal of Educational Psychology in 1976, put learning in terms of different levels of processing. Basically, they suggest learning can fall on a spectrum of surface level processing, which is more like rapid fire memorization, to deeper processing, or linking new information to an information network, which leads to better recall. And with mnemonics, you're making more of these connections. Sometimes it's between random bits of information, like setting the periodic table to the tune of a song you know. But there are a lot of memory hacks that psychologists have proposed over the years and tested in research experiments. Not all of them will work for everyone in every learning situation. There are just way too many variables in real life, but they can be helpful. If you're learning new words, you can try using the keyword method, a term that was coined in the mid-1970s by researchers from Stanford University and studied frequently in the next couple of decades. This mnemonic can help people learn words in new languages by connecting how a new word sounds to a keyword in English, for example. Then, the English keyword is linked to a strong visual image that helps you recall what that new word means. So in Spanish, say you're trying to learn the word perro, which means dog. You might pick the keyword pear and imagine a dog holding a pear in its mouth to connect the two. The keyword method could also help with more complicated vocab in English. Like when you think of the word melancholy, you can picture a sad melon to remember the meaning. But what if you're a more spatial, visual learner? Then you can use the technique known as the method of loci, which was first described by ancient Greek and Roman texts and studied by psychologists from the 1960s until now. This strategy allows you to create a kind of mind palace, where you mentally walk through rooms in a building or some other familiar space, the loci. Along the way, you can visualize things like symbols that represent key points in a speech you're going to give, or meeting the US presidents in order. So when it comes to school, trying to memorize one fact at a time might not be the best study strategy. Instead, it might help to connect that new information to other things you learned, or even make some kind of story out of it. And finally, there's chunking, a theory first proposed by a Harvard psychologist in 1956 that is still studied today. It's basically when you learn a whole bunch of information and organize it into chunks that make sense. Like instead of trying to memorize a sequence of 8 separate numbers, you can break it into 2 chunks that sound like years. So it feels like you have fewer individual things to remember, and it's easier to store and recall more information. And with more and more exposure to the information you're trying to learn, like when you're studying, the larger the chunks of connected information can become. There's no replacement for paying attention in class, taking good notes, and spending time studying when it comes to learning. But if you're having a little trouble remembering stuff, you might be able to use some mnemonics, because sometimes we need all the help we can get. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow, brought to you by our patrons on Patreon.
So let's go back to that peg word method for a minute. There's different types of peg systems you can choose from. All of them use the same method, the use of a concrete object to represent each number. What's different is how you choose the object. We can divide these approaches into the following categories: the rhyming method, the meaning method, the alphabet method, and the lookalike method. So with the rhyming method, or some people call this approach the one is a gun technique. Many people using this approach have a pre-memorized list like this. So 1 is a gun, 2 is a shoe, 3 is a tree, 4 is a door. As you can see, when using the rhyming method, you create pegs that rhyme with a number to create a pre-memorized list. In the next stage, memorizers visualize the information they want to remember and mentally link it with the rhyming word. In the meaning method, you create pegs that help you recall the sound and meaning of the words you want to recall later. So for example, to remember the word exploration with the rhyming pair, 1 is a gun, maybe you visualize ex-police officers with guns patrolling an area where oil exploration is taking place. Take the word quadrangle to give you an additional example. The most immediate and obvious association is probably a quad bike. So since a quadrangle has 4 sides and a quad bike has 4 wheels, it generally works to cover both sound and meaning. Now, at the end of the day, mnemonics are only as effective as you make them, and they work better for some people than others. I had a friend in college who used to make really dirty mnemonics, and that helped her to remember stuff because it was bizarre and usually kind of gross and was really effective in helping her to remember things. Now that works for some people, it's not going to work for others. So at the end of the day, as the video said, there really is no substitute for good old-fashioned studying, but here's some tips that you might want to give a try. I'm not going to show this video because it's pretty long. You can take a look by yourself, but this is a fascinating TED Talk lecture. It's called Feats of Memory Anyone Can Do. And the talk is given by Joshua Fowler, who's a science writer who accidentally won the US Memory Championship. And so he explains a mnemonic device called the Memory Palace. And so you hear about this a bit in pop culture. Sherlock Holmes will make reference to it. I think Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory has mentioned it as well. But I like this talk because it sort of walks you through the process, or at least how Joshua sees it. So that's all I've got for you for this week. This wraps up our conversations on memory. So I will see you next week.